Welcome to yet another episode in our series of conversations with persons who've been there, done that. These are multifaceted personalities whom you have met, whom you have known of, perhaps whom you continue to know. And yet there are aspects of their personality, of the richness of their knowledge and experience that we would like to revisit along with you through this conversation. The intention is to touch on some aspects of what they have done, the value systems that have informed their work and their life, and to extract therefrom whatever lessons we have for ourselves going forward. In this episode, I have great pleasure in bringing to you a person who, if I may put it in summary form, is my last reference point for all matters accounting and auditing. And I have drawn blank elsewhere. He is the person that I reach out to, as I'm sure most people in this country do. Without further ado, let me welcome Mr. P.R. Ramesh, former chairman, Deloitte, India, and someone who wears multiple hats. Let me start with what you told me just before we got into this conversation. You said you've joined the board of a large entity just now, very recently. After having been on the other side of the divide, as it were, of looking at companies, the financials, and much more, with a critical eye, with a skeptical eye, if I may call it that. What is the change for you to be on the other side and clearly to contribute, add value? What is it that you're seeking to do?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Damodaran, first of all, for your very kind words of me being the last resort. I really hope that is what everybody feels, but it's not something which I've, I was myself aware of. Also, all I tried to do in my life was try and be up to date in my knowledge of accounting and auditing, and try and shape the future of accounting and auditing as we go along. But to your specific question, there is a completely different view from this side of the table as opposed to being on the other side. There are two or three aspects to it. First is I have now great sympathy for the directors of a company. When I was an auditor, and as in the Companies Act, and as typically auditors say, it is the responsibility of the management and the directors to prepare the financials. And the way the Companies Act is written, auditors sign only after the directors sign. It was almost as if, and as an auditor, I almost believed that the directors were the know-all and knew everything, and they're supposed to know everything. They're signing on the financials, and I was merely confirming. And I knew much lesser than the directors. In reality now, when I sit on the other side, as directors, one spends about 75 to 100 hours, even if they are assuming there are too many frequent meetings, and maybe 100 hours in a year. How would a director in 100 hours in a year be able to discharge all those responsibilities which are expected of him, when his large part of the information he gets is at board meetings and presentations? And whereas we as auditors used to be in the company, inside the company, had access to all books, records, and we had the ability to smell, we had the ability to see, we were there. And yet in form, we are supposed to rely on directors who are approving the accounts. So the first point is, the change for me was an appreciation of the enormity of the responsibility cast on a director, disproportionate to his ability to be able to discharge that. As opposed to an auditor, I felt that he is more able to do it. The second for me is, I mean, I was all along in my life maybe an hard-nosed accountant, an auditor. So everything one looked at through the lens of an accountant and an auditor. But when you move into the other side, you look at it from a business perspective. You need to add value to it. You look at the interests of stakeholders. You look at long term as opposed to short term. You are looking at, I would say, that shift from, hindsight to foresight. You're focusing on the future as opposed to focusing on what has happened. As an auditor, you significantly focused on what has happened. So this is a big shift. And third, it brought me out of conversations revolving only accounting and auditing to being part of a large team where nobody else, or maybe very few, are financially literate, but they are leaders in many other fields. So it's a big change, and that is important I think, for everybody. You get a completely different perspective on every matter when you hear somebody else who's an expert on some other subject. Of course, in matters of finance, everybody must be looking at me in the same way, but it's a great learning experience.
So from what I hear you say, clearly there is an expectation gap. What the lawmakers, what the regulators, and in fact, what the world outside expects of directors, and what the directors are actually able to deliver. So that expectation gap is not going to go away in a hurry anytime. But let me get to another expectation gap with which you are very familiar, which is the expectation gap regarding auditors. What the world expects of auditors. They know everything, they see everything, they sign off, and after that, that's the gospel truth. No matter what the disclaimers are, we won't read the disclaimers because the auditor has signed off on that. And that expectation gap, that clearly you are not able to see as much as you would like to see. But the world thinks that you've seen it all. They blame the auditing profession for things that might go wrong. How does one address that expectation gap? Because that is very critical to keeping the corporate world safe and secure.
Okay, here I believe this is an issue from both sides, meaning the auditors and the public at large insofar as expectation. The expectation gap has only widened. And it's also true that from an audit profession, there is a performance gap. There are deficiencies in delivering what they profess to deliver. And that is also one cause of angst insofar as the auditing profession of being perceived is concerned. However, I think it's extremely important that the auditing profession realizes the shift in expectations. The shift in expectations has come about because of a lot of changes in the environment. Technology today is ensuring that companies which succeed are those which are able to have information much ahead of others. And that is why, and more insightful information. And that is why what they expect is completely different. It is today more of insights and foresights, as the term I use, and the use of technology. Whereas the auditors are prisoners in their own world, their own standards, and they still are prisoners of the words true and fair, not realizing that the user of the financial statements or user of the services expects something more. I personally believe that the auditing profession has to move ahead and not resist change. Because in a technology-driven world, if this is exactly what an auditor is delivering, he will become redundant. Machines can do what an auditor is doing today in terms of looking at data, interpreting the data, and giving out a conclusion, which an auditor believes he is the expert, but he's still relying on data which he sees. So I think unless this profession moves away from that, if the expectation is to detect frauds, he has to use tools to be able to detect frauds. If the expectation is to predict failures, He's the expert. He's the accounting expert. He's the auditing expert. He spends more time in the company. He should be able to predict a failure of a company rather than a director or somebody else or the user of financial statements. So I think the profession needs to move ahead. Its toolkit has to change. Its mindset has to change. Its application of its audit has to change. And the purpose of audit has to go beyond true and fair. That's exactly what has come up in England too. And I'm hoping that this profession will realize that. I'm no longer in that profession, but when I see it from the other side, this is what I think I expect, given the limitations of what a director role is.
You know, in England, we're going back several years, when it was realized that the accounts did not reflect the correct picture, then nobody waited for the government or the regulator to do anything. The profession got together along with the stock exchange and set up the Cadbury Committee. Would you say, in the light of some of the failures that we've had, I don't want to use the word failure, maybe the shortcomings, the performance gaps which have manifested in ways that have caused quite a lot of disquiet, has India's Cadbury moment come?
Absolutely. In fact, our problem in India in any regulation or any change, even whether it's for the profession or the framers of laws or whatever it is the absence of a root cause analysis. When there is an air crash or whatever it is, there is a root cause analysis which is done. Here, there is no root cause analysis. There is a perception that this is the reason, and laws are introduced and changes are made. Now, clearly what one needs to do, including the profession, is to do that introspection and detailed root cause analysis as to why it is happening. And then when you do a correction, before you do the correction, you also need to be clear on what the end state will be. What will be the result of the correction? When you go to a doctor, for instance, if he's prescribing you a medicine, he's expecting a certain outcome of that medicine, right? And you expect you see some change within a certain period. And that, unfortunately, in all the changes which are coming up today, it's all more reactive. One does not know what is the end state, whether it is an audit rotation or whether it is changes to independent directors, how they should be appointed, or related party transactions. One is just reactive and hoping that that is the panacea for all the ills. But actually the end state is not even looked at or even envisioned before one makes the change. And I think that is it. And you talked of expectation gap and performance gap, and I spoke about that. It's something like a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. You see, from a mother-in-law's lens, there is an expectation gap, a performance gap. From a daughter-in-law's lens, there is an expectation gap. So I think we need to bridge this. There is both, actually.
They must both consult the same ophthalmologist, I think. Then perhaps the gap can be bridged. True. But, you spoke about audit rotation. So we've had audit rotation for a few years now. It's been spoken about for many years earlier. And now, of course, RBI has mandated joint audit in the case of NBFCs, etc. Now, joint audit necessarily means that smaller firms will come in as the second auditors, and maybe they will graduate to being the lead auditors over time. How do you address the question of capacity building of smaller audit firms?
It's a serious issue. In fact, I have an extreme solution which the profession will not accept. And I'm on to the fundamental question as to when professions have become business. Why should we not have funding into CA firms? Why should CA firms be only partnerships or limited liability partnerships where a partner's ability to infuse capital is restricted by the growth of the firm and his own earnings, etc.? Why not we have funds in so a firm can then acquire talent? Today, even if a small firm wants to become big overnight, it is not by getting a big audit. It cannot service that audit. It is by having enough financial muscle to be able to attract talent and pay that talent, which when we talk of large firms, they have been doing it over 100 years or they have affiliations with networks which have deep pockets, or where the investments happen somewhere and they're able to benefit. So the problem with these solutions which are being done is they are not, the remedy for the disease is different from the disease itself, meaning you are trying to address the issue of concentration, or you're trying to address the issue of capacity. This is not the way that you're not addressing the issue of quality there. But if you have to address the issue of quality, the mechanisms have to be different. Capacity can only be built, if you want, in today's age, in an inorganic manner. Organic growth, it is not possible. On the contrary, what has happened, like it happened in the insurance industry, which will happen in the financial services sector too. In the insurance industry, when the laws were introduced insofar as audit, it was said you will do one non-life and one life, and that too joint. So effectively, you're doing half life and half non-life as an audit. How will you build capacity? Why will anybody, and in a sector which is highly regulated and with a lot of laws, why would anybody invest in training its people when you can do half life and half non-life, and also with rotation? So that's the same thing which is, and now when the laws were being revised, I was part of that committee, we decided to add half health also. So a little bit of relief, but that's not going to, you will never have firms which specialize in audit of insurance industry. You will have the same situation in financial services. So why would anybody want to invest in, with the high riskiness of audit? You would rather be a consultant in financial services industry rather than be an auditor.
Moving to another question, this has caused a lot of concern for some years now, and has been commented on adversely even by a regulator. This is independence of the statutory auditor and the perception of absence of independence arising out of non-audit work being done by the stat auditor. Is that something that we have put to bed, or is that still work in progress?
It is still work in progress, because what happens is, you take for India, for example, few firms voluntarily said they will not do any non-audit services other than, or rather any non-attest services they will not do, because there are certain attest services which are required, certifications which are required, which only an auditor can do, which is in addition to the auditor. But the big chunk, which is tax advisory and many other advisory things which are permitted, subject to, of course, NFRA holding a different view, those has the same issue, because we are trying to address 4 different risks or threats. There is a threat of self-review. There is a threat of misplaced confidence, which is addressed through rotation. There is a threat of advocacy, which still remains, because you are the tax advisor and you are relying on your colleague is the tax advisor, and you as an auditor are reviewing the tax provision where the interpretations of your colleague are there. It's not exactly a self-review, or therefore there's an advocacy threat, and there is a threat of intimidation, which depends upon how much of that entity is, how much of the group forms part of your income. Okay, then there is a threat of intimidation. So the point I'm coming to is, why is there a lot of work in progress? This whole principle of independence comes in a way from the Zulu proverb, which says a dog with a bone in its mouth cannot bark. So if you have other services, you cannot bark. So call it what you mean. You can say tax service is permitted, therefore what is wrong? But address the principle. If you want to address the principle that an auditor should not do any service and therefore he is free to bark, then you can't allow others, because it will impact the profession. Many chartered accountants, small and medium, do tax services for their clients. So how can we suddenly do all of those things will be the issue. So there is a lot of work in progress, and I don't think it will get overnight completed. My own guess is hopefully it's somewhere, one should say, for the top 100, top 500 companies, auditors should not render any service or any non-attest service. So at least the big firms should be able to manage. If you have a 25% market share, you have the rest 75 to be able to do others for companies to render other services. Then over a period of time, we can have that as a law.
I want to move to something which is very topical now for the wrong reasons and take you back to your younger years. And that is cricket. I know you were a very good cricket player. I know you were a very good cricket player in your younger days. And I also know that you batted left-handed and bowled right-handed. Which of this was a conscious choice and which came naturally? The left hand or the right hand?
The right hand. I am a right-handed otherwise.
Okay.
I was a right-hand batsman, but in those days I saw Gary Sobers and shifted from batting right-handed to left-handed. And thereafter, I never thought that batting right-handed was easy. So early in my life, they were the role models, and Gary Sobers, of course, was the best all-rounder, as you know. And that's how it happened.
Neil Harvey also was a left-hander who defined
Absolutely.
elegance. I thought his cover drives defined elegance. We're not seeing a patch of that now. And you were playing cricket at a time when some legends of cricket were with you at the Maridpalli Cricket Club. M.L. Jayasima, what Vizzy used to call more luck and more joy. The man who landed went from the airport to the ground and battled. Phenomenal, right?
In Australia.
What was it about those times that has changed now for the worse?
Okay, there are many things. One is, as a cricketer then, we funded everything ourselves. I had to take my subscription to my own club was 10 rupees. And there was no earnings from it, right? So my parents had a great fight with my parents to even get that subscription money to the club to be able to do that. And you couldn't afford a bat because the club had to buy a bat. The club bats were expensive. You couldn't afford pads. You had no gear of your own. Everybody shared bats. And the only thing which was your own perhaps was your shoes, which you had to spend money, and the white flannel dress which you wore to some extent. Most cricketers in those days were poor cricketers. The objective of learning that game was to get a job. And you got employed in the banks, or you got employed in railways, or you got a little later, central excise and other departments also started. So everybody, and those who played test cricket joined State Bank of India. They were there and they were given enough time to go and continuously practice. So there was no money in cricket, which at that point, today there is so much glare, everybody gets endorsements, so I feel sorry for M.L. Jayasima or the cricketers of those days. Even now Sunil Gavaskar may be earning because he's part of the television channels, etc. But imagine the cricketers of those days, whether it's the Prasanna Chandrasekhar, Bishan Singh Bedi, or Farooq Engineer, or any of those. Very sad. So second is, we had no protective gear. Helmet came much later, or some form of protection came after Nari contractor got hit on the head from the Charlie Griffith. So we never had elbow guards. We never had even thigh pads at those days, or helmets. So but yet the bowling was no less fast. It was extremely fast in those days. So you developed skills and you played, you were far more brave than whatever it is. I know we had luck, we had our share of injuries and all of it. But and I personally felt without that media glare, without all of it, we were far more sincere in the way we played a game. And there were no television cameras. Today, because of the cameras, they wait for the third umpire decision or wait for replay to then they used to walk. There were many known cricketers who would walk. And where are those qualities today? Umpires made mistakes, you lived with it. It's very, very interesting times. And if you had to watch or even a Ranji Trophy game in some between, let's say, then Mysore and Madras, people used to go stand outside the stadium the previous night to get a seat with
That's right.
television.
You take me back to my childhood. I waited overnight to get into a stadium to watch cricket. I never played cricket at any serious level. Let me take you to something else. One of your directorships is an FMCG company.
That's right.
And of course, before you joined, it did have a controversy with one of its products having attracted adverse attention of one regulator. We had another FMCG company, which earlier for its chocolates ran into some problem because some of it was found to be worm infested. Of course, the problems got put behind. The companies got back on their feet quickly. And now it's a matter of maybe corporate history if somebody wants to read it. How important in such situations is communication? Because we noticed that people reached out very quickly in one case, not so quickly in another case.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if the communication strategy is wrong, then you're worsening the situation rather than, improving the situation. And in many of these, it is blown out of proportions, and it can happen to even pharma companies today. If one drug, there is a wrong side effect, or you never know whether it is because of a failure of the physician, doctor, whoever it may be. Pharma companies can go through such severe crisis today. They also can go through crisis through FDA and other inspections where their brand can get significantly damaged, or they can go through issues on recall, just as automobile companies can face. And therefore, I think the communication is the key, and the communication must reflect honesty, confirm facts, what is the correct factual situation. And when I say honesty, if there is a deficiency, a clear time plan to correct that deficiency and to withdraw products if it is. Currently, let's say one of the controversies which this sector may be facing is whether certain foods are healthy. Now, your foods are not designed to be healthy. Your product portfolio will have foods which are for taste, which are, for instance, a chocolate, which are others for nutrition, which are not necessarily great on taste. And that is where the communication strategy becomes important, to clearly say, these are not designed for this purpose. For that matter, take that particular company's case. The issue was MSG. And the fact is, there is MSG in everything, not just in that product, not in many other products. It's a question of what is the degree and what it is. It is not that somebody said it is MSG free. I don't think that was the statement. So how transparent you are in your communication and say, look, this is what it is, so that a person can understand that it is blown out of proportion.
Interesting you say that, because even as we speak, I think communication has been a problem with some companies not reaching out to investors, telling them what the resolution is and why a certain thing is being proposed. And then you come to grief because in the absence of communication, you get an adverse voting pattern that the media loves to play up for obvious reasons. Tell me, as I wind up this, I know you're interested in music. I know that, and I'm guessing that you have interests in Carnatic music, traditional music. Is there a music connection in your family?
Not really. If other than, you see, I can say there are members in my family who are passionate about Carnatic music. Personally, I am not. To that extent, your guess is correct. I listen to music variety, whether it's Western classical, Western country music, Indian old Hindi music, all of it, less of Carnatic music because it's not something which I've been able to pick up. The only connection to, well, I don't think any of our family members are singers or anything else. So I think it's more being in South. That is where the, shall I say, affinity to Carnatic music comes in, as opposed to anything else, really speaking. Yeah, we are Prativadi Bhayankara, so PB, and I don't think the PB family, other than PB Srinivas, who was known to be in that field, but otherwise we are more known for debates and maybe arguments or something to that. As a clan, Prativadi Bhayankara means terror in a debate.
Living up to the name, isn't it? Okay.
I don't know.
What later came to be called the argumentative Indian.
Yes, Samarthya Sen.
Okay, you're right. What do you propose to do going forward other than directorships?
You see, I read a lot, and one thing, over a number of years, people have written to me, and it's something which I even at one point in time told my mentor, Mr. Malegam, and I'm going the same way in terms of he's not having written a book. You see, people like him who are brilliant, what happens is, if like a Nani Palkiwala today, Kanga and Palkiwala book on taxation is still the most sought after book. Others can improvise on it. A Palkiwala at least wrote a book. Mr. Malegam doesn't have a book on accounting, though he is the most brilliant accountant I've ever come across anywhere. He was the Nani Palkiwala of the accounting profession. And my biggest, grouse against my own self is that I haven't written a book. A lot of people have come time and again and told me over the last 10 years, saying, start writing the book. Whether it's accounting, auditing, whatever it is. And that's my aspiration, other than directorship. I think that requires a lot of commitment. It requires skill, no doubt. But it's always the first time. If you write one book, then maybe you will, I don't know. So,
if you hadn't said this, I would have suggested this to you, because I want to sign off with Francis Bacon, who said, reading makes a full man, writing an exact man, and conference a ready man. Clearly, you have excelled in reading, you've excelled in conference. I think it's time to write that book. Yeah, Ramesh, thank you. It's been a great pleasure having you in this conversation.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you very much. Thank you.
Pleasure too. Thank you, Baba.